The presumption is, A, that the Beatles would get together again. John and Yoko split, Paul and Linda split. At the time, I do whatever I feel is right. And whatever happened, happened, you know. I'm happy now.
John Lennon beat his wife. He abandoned his son. He was addicted to heroin. And in the end, he was shot dead by a so-called fan with 5 bullets. That's not how people usually begin a story about a peace icon. But that is John Lennon, raw, contradictory, and dangerously flawed. While the world still sings Imagine as a prayer for humanity, few dare to confront the question. If John truly believed in a world without hatred, why was he filled with so much rage? He was the soul of the Beatles, the voice of a generation, the man who infuriated the Catholic Church with a single sentence. But he was also a child abandoned by his mother, a boy who witnessed her death with his own eyes, a man who used his guitar to fill the endless void inside him. John Lennon wasn't just a legend, he was a living indictment of fame, trauma, and the desperate need to be loved. And his story can't be told through music alone. Let's go back in time and trace John Lennon's journey, from deep emotional scars to the height of global fame, to uncover what truly lay beneath his dazzling spotlight. This is the story of a lonely boy from Liverpool who became a legend, only to be gunned down in the heart of New York. It's a truth that's hard to hear, but it needs to be told. Raw, heartbreaking, and without leaving out the darkness. Early life. John Winston Lennon was born to the sound of air raid sirens in a Liverpool battered by Nazi bombs. But while the bombings over the city lasted only minutes, the war within Lennon's own family raged through his entire childhood. His father, Alfred Lennon, was a sailor, physically absent for most of John's early years. But more than just absent in body, Alfred vanished entirely from the idea of fatherhood. When he returned, he proposed taking his son to live in New Zealand. Julia, John's mother, refused. Yet instead of keeping her son close, she handed him over to her strict older sister, Mimi Smith. No one truly fought for John. He was passed along like a duty, not a choice. A woman of principle, Aunt Mimi raised John with love expressed through discipline, not affection. She once told him bluntly, "The guitar's all very well, John, but you'll never make a living out of it." He remembered those words, and later framed that exact quote in his living room, a reminder of where he came from. The only person who gave John any softness in that house was George Smith, Mimi's husband. George taught him to read, draw, and play the harmonica, and was the first to make John feel unconditionally loved. But in 1955, when John was just 14, George died suddenly of a liver hemorrhage. It was the second time John lost a father figure. Julia, his biological mother, wasn't entirely absent. She visited, took him out, and was the first to spark his love of music. She bought him his first guitar and allowed him to play rock and roll, even as Mimi sternly forbade it. But the relationship between Julia and Mimi was tense, pulling John between two worlds, one of cold discipline, the other of fragile freedom. Then came the greatest tragedy. In 1958, just after leaving Mimi's house to catch a bus, Julia was struck and killed by an off-duty policeman, right in front of her son. John, then 17, stood frozen on the sidewalk. No scream, no tears, just a void that would never be filled. "Mother had me, but I never had her," he later wrote in the haunting song, Mother. From that point, John began to armor himself. He masked pain with sarcasm, used humor as a weapon to strike before being struck. At Quarry Bank High School, he became known for crude caricatures, provocative remarks to teachers, and a spirit of rebellion fueled by the feeling of being misunderstood. Despite his sharp intellect, his academic performance remained below average. He was accepted into the Liverpool College of Art, where he honed his drawing and writing skills and was exposed to counterculture. It was there he met Cynthia Powell, his future first wife, and began forming his own artistic identity, drawn to Lewis Carroll, Oscar Wilde, and other icons of eccentricity, satire, and defiance. When John discovered music, it wasn't an escape. It was a weapon. At 16, he formed the Quarrymen, the band that would later evolve into the Beatles, as a way of screaming at the world, "I'm still here. I won't vanish like all the other grown-ups." John Lennon didn't grow up in love. He grew up in the absence of hugs that never came. And that absence echoed through every note, every lyric, every act of rebellion the world would one day call genius. Early career. In 1956, as Britain still lingered in the haze of cigarette smoke and post-war austerity, a quiet musical wave began to rise. Skiffle, a grassroots blend of jazz, blues, and American country. Armed with a cheap guitar and a hunger to be part of something bigger than himself, John Lennon formed his first band, the Quarrymen. The name came from Quarry Bank High School, but the band's spirit came from somewhere else entirely, rebellious, careless, and slightly chaotic. John didn't play music to please anyone. He snarled into the microphone like he was venting rage, his eyes dripping with sarcasm toward the world. But amid the shouting and clumsy chords, something glimmered, a raw, untamed fire that hadn't yet been named. Then came July 6, 1957, a date now etched into legend. The Quarrymen were playing at the St. Peter's Church Fete in Woolton, a suburb of Liverpool. In the crowd stood a quiet 15-year-old named Paul McCartney, watching the shaggy-haired, defiant frontman. After the performance, the two were introduced. Paul, already a skilled guitarist, was invited to join the band a few weeks later. That meeting wasn't just the addition of talent. It was a collision of two opposing but perfectly complementary artistic forces. Lennon was instinctive, raw, and confrontational. McCartney was structured, polished, and carried the melody of pop. They argued, they challenged each other, and because of that, they pushed one another further than anyone else ever could. Next came George Harrison, a quiet, even younger boy, but already a gifted lead guitarist. Lennon initially dismissed him as too young, but Harrison's talent made even John nod in approval. The lineup was taking shape. At the time, the band kept changing names, from Johnny and the Moondogs to the Silver Beatles, and finally, the Beatles, a clever play on the word Beatles and beat. Ringo Starr hadn't joined yet, and they were far from famous, but they had something even more valuable, a shared dream, though none of them dared say it aloud. In 1960, they landed a contract to perform in Hamburg, Germany, in gritty nightclubs. Each night, they played 6 to 8 hours in a haze of smoke and drunkenness. It was here that the Beatles shed their school band image and became real musicians. John Lennon described this period as a transformation, both musically and personally. They crammed into a storeroom behind a cinema, ate sporadically, and were exhausted from lack of sleep. But in that dark, unforgiving place, they built the resilience to face any audience, no matter how drunk, hostile, or indifferent. Returning to England, they still struggled in a music scene that slammed doors on anyone not from London. Many record labels turned them down. But then came Brian Epstein, a polished, perceptive record store manager, who heard them perform at the Cavern Club in Liverpool. Epstein saw what others didn't: the explosive potential beneath the leather jackets and wild riffs. He became their manager, secured them a deal with Parlophone, and introduced them to George Martin, the seasoned producer at Abbey Road Studios. When their debut single, Love Me Do, was released in 1962, it only reached #1, 17 on the charts. But it was the first signal, a signal that John Lennon, the boy once abandoned by his mother and branded a rebel by his school, was about to change the face of popular music forever. Successful career. When John Lennon walked into Abbey Road Studios in 1962, he was still a sharp, ambitious young artist, uncertain of the world he was about to change. But within just a few years, alongside Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, He transformed the Beatles into the greatest cultural phenomenon of the 20th century, a storm that not only swept through music, but shaped an entire generation. At the beginning, John was the spiritual leader of the group. He had founded the Quarrymen back in 1956, brought Paul and George into the fold, and gradually turned a schoolboy band into the Beatles the world came to know. With his signature raspy voice, biting lyrics, and experimental musical instincts, Lennon infused early hits like Please Please Me, She Loves You, and All My Loving with a wild energy and sly humor that set the group apart from every other act of the time. In 1964, when the Beatles arrived in the US and appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, over 70 million viewers watched. The Beatlemania craze exploded worldwide, and John emerged as the face of intelligence, wit, and cool defiance. Yet with each passing day, fame made him feel more estranged from himself, something he later spoke about candidly in interviews. Starting in 1965, Lennon began to shift his creative focus. Songs like Help and Nowhere Man were no longer just love songs. They were personal confessions of isolation and existential crisis. The Beatles moved away from their clean-cut suits and into realms of surrealism, philosophy, and psychedelic rock, with Lennon at the forefront of this transformation. Tomorrow Never Knows, 1966, stands as a prime example. Inspired by meditation and Timothy Leary's writings, the track used reversed tape loops, hypnotic drones, and a structure unlike anything in pop music at the time. Lennon no longer aimed to please, he aimed to create art. But 1966 also brought one of the biggest controversies of his career. In an interview with the London Evening Standard, Lennon remarked that young people seem to care more about the Beatles than religion. Specifically, "We're more popular than Jesus now." The American media twisted the quote, sparking a furious backlash. Radio stations banned Beatles songs, albums were burned, bomb threats were made. Though Lennon publicly apologized and expressed regret, a deep crack had formed between the band and the American public. After manager Brian Epstein's death in 1967, the Beatles lost the one person who could mediate their clashing egos. Tensions rose, especially between John and Paul. By then, Lennon was deeply involved with avant-garde Japanese artist Yoko Ono and began bringing her into the studio, something unprecedented, and it strained the group dynamic further. Yet this period also birthed astonishing creative highs. The Beatles, the White Album, was a mosaic of styles and emotions, with Lennon contributing raw, introspective pieces like Your Blues and Julia. But the band was no longer a cohesive unit. Each member recorded separately with different engineers in separate rooms. Although Let It Be was released last, it was recorded before Abbey Road under intense tension. Behind-the-scenes footage shows a detached Lennon, a frustrated Paul trying to keep things together, and George walking out mid-session. While the album was eventually completed, the spirit of "We're a Band" had already died. Despite unprecedented success, the Beatles couldn't escape internal discord. The once powerful songwriting bond between Lennon and McCartney had begun to fracture. Creative rivalry and artistic disagreements pulled them apart. Lennon, always seeking freedom and self-expression, felt stifled by the pressure to maintain the group's image. McCartney, meanwhile, craved structure and sought more control over the creative process. Yoko Ono's presence only deepened the rift. Lennon saw her as his soulmate, spiritually and artistically, and welcomed her constant presence during recordings. This disrupted the familiar studio dynamic and caused friction among the other members, as well as public backlash. But Lennon defended her fiercely, saying she gave him the understanding he had never felt before. By the late 1960s, tensions had reached a boiling point. Arguments in the studio, pressure from fame, and diverging artistic visions tore the band apart. In September 1969, John Lennon privately informed the band he was leaving. Although he agreed to keep it quiet for the sake of the upcoming album's release, The truth was, he had been the first to walk away, even though Paul was the one who later made it public. For Lennon, the Beatles had become a closed chapter, a glorious, suffocating chapter from which he needed to breathe. When asked later about his decision, Lennon didn't place blame. He simply admitted that he no longer recognized himself within that symbol. The Beatles didn't break up over any one scandal. They ended because four very different individuals could no longer walk the same path. And through it all, John Lennon wasn't just a musician. He was the soul, the spark, the voice of rebellion, and the first to step away. Solo career. When the Beatles broke up in 1970, John Lennon wasn't just leaving a band. He was breaking free from a myth he had helped create. The world lost a collective icon, but Lennon began to write his own chapter, raw, flawed, sometimes chaotic, but entirely his own. His debut solo album, John Lennon Plastic Ono Band, released at the end of 1970, wasn't an easy pop record. It was a primal scream from deep within. Influenced by primal scream therapy, which he and Yoko Ono underwent with Dr. Arthur Janov, the album featured songs like Mother, Working Class Hero, and God. Gone were the layers of production and the backing band. What remained was a man, a guitar, and the scars left by childhood, war, and fame. In 1971, Lennon released Imagine, his most successful solo album. The title track quickly became a global anthem for peace and anti-war sentiment. Yet even in success, John remained self-critical and confrontational, taking jabs at himself and the music world in tracks like Crippled Inside and How Do You Sleep, a scathing attack on Paul McCartney, reflecting the bitterness following the Beatles' split. Lennon's solo career never took the safe route. He constantly experimented with political themes, avant-garde art, and deeply personal revelations. His anti-war activism drew the attention of the FBI, and under the Nixon administration, he faced the threat of deportation. From 1972 to 1975, much of his energy was spent in legal battles to remain in the U.S. with Yoko and raise their child in New York. During this period, his musical output was uneven. Sometime in New York City, 1972, a collaboration with Yoko Ono was harshly criticized for its overt political lyrics. Yet it showed that Lennon no longer sought stardom. He wanted to be a citizen with a voice. Songs like Woman is the Neener of the World sparked major controversy, but boldly addressed issues pop music had never touched so directly. From 1973 to 1975, John entered a phase he called his Lost Weekend, an 18-month separation from Yoko, during which he lived in Los Angeles. He had a relationship with assistant May Pang, partied heavily with Harry Nilsson and Keith Moon, and recorded the albums Walls and Bridges, 1974, and Rock and Roll, 1975. Despite the chaos, this period produced his first solo number. One single on the Billboard charts, Whatever Gets You Through the Night, featuring backing vocals by Elton John. But the most profound moment came in 1975 with the birth of his son, Sean. John made a radical decision: to walk away from music for 5 years. In a move that stunned the industry, he withdrew from public life. No albums, no performances, choosing instead to stay home, cook, raise his son, and bake bread. "I don't want Sean to grow up like Julian, hearing about his father on the radio," he said. When he returned in 1980, John and Yoko released Double Fantasy. It revealed a rejuvenated spirit, full of love, peace, and balance. Songs like Just Like Starting Over, Woman, and Watching the Wheels showed a man who had let go of inner turmoil and embraced a quieter, more authentic life. John Lennon's solo career was a journey of self-discovery, from the wounds of childhood to the pursuit of peace and the meaning of life. His works were more than music. They were the truest expressions of an artist's soul. And that legacy, timeless and unfiltered, is one the world will never forget. Personal life. If music was where John Lennon found freedom, then his personal life was where he remained entangled in obligations, contradictions, and choices that were never easy to love or to live with. Behind the image of the guitar-wielding peace advocate was a man with two very different marriages, two sons with opposing fates, and a fatherhood journey that was never quite complete. John met Cynthia Powell when they were both students at the Liverpool College of Art. Despite their contrasting personalities, Cynthia was calm and reserved, while Lennon was impulsive and rebellious. They quickly fell in love. When Cynthia became pregnant in 1962, John quietly married her, as the Beatles were beginning to rise in fame and the public wasn't ready to accept a teen idol with a wife and child. They had a son, Julian Lennon, but family was never John's priority. The Beatles' meteoric rise took him away, not just physically, but emotionally. Cynthia described her years with John as a long stretch of loneliness, left in the shadows while her husband became a global icon. John grew distant, temperamental, and often indifferent toward their son. When the marriage finally collapsed in 1968, it was because Cynthia discovered John was having an affair, not with an ordinary woman, but with a boundary-pushing Japanese artist named Yoko Ono. Yoko Ono's arrival didn't just mark the end of John's first marriage, it marked the beginning of a new era, unconventional, controversial, and inseparable from his art and identity. With Yoko, John found a partner in both emotion and intellect. They didn't just love, they created together, protested together, lived out experimental artistic visions together. But the relationship triggered strong backlash. Many within the Beatles felt Yoko was overstepping into the band's space, and the public often blamed her for the group's eventual split. By the early 1970s, even John and Yoko's marriage hit a breaking point. In 1973, they separated briefly, and John entered a relationship with assistant May Pang, a period later referred to as his lost weekend, which lasted nearly 18 months. During this time, he lived in Los Angeles, partied with friends like Harry Nilsson and Ringo Starr, and, crucially, spent real time with Julian for the first time. The long-neglected father-son bond began to mend, though it was never truly healed. In 1975, John reunited with Yoko. That same year, she became pregnant with their son, John Lennon. This time, John chose to step back. He turned down performances, stopped releasing music, and devoted himself entirely to raising his child. For the next 5 years, he all but vanished from the music scene. No public appearances, no interviews, no stage. Friends described him as the quintessential stay-at-home dad, cooking meals, playing with Sean, even learning to bake bread. For the first and only time, John fully embraced fatherhood. But the irony was painful. As John tried to be a good father to Sean, the distance between him and Julian grew. Now a teenager, Julian watched his father shower attention on a half-brother with all the love he himself had never received. In many later interviews, Julian spoke openly of his bitterness, though he still acknowledged inheriting both talent and blood from John. John Lennon's personal life was a study in contradiction. On one hand, the artist who preached love and peace. On the other, a man who had hurt his first wife and emotionally neglected his son. He could write "Imagine" to inspire the world's hope, yet be lost when trying to build a family of his own. He fought for women's rights, but displayed controlling behavior in his first marriage. He taught Sean how to bake, but never told Julian a bedtime story. John once said that people shouldn't be defined by their past mistakes, but by their efforts to change. And perhaps in his final years, when he stepped back, chose fatherhood, chose quiet family life in New York, that was the moment John Lennon stopped being a legend and started being a man simply learning how to love the right way. Final years and legacy. By the mid-1970s, While the world eagerly awaited the next move from the rebellious ex-Beatle, John Lennon chose to disappear. No stages, no recordings, no shocking statements. From 1975 to 1980, he dedicated 5 full years to living as ordinarily as possible in the Dakota apartment in New York, taking on the role of a stay-at-home father, a husband learning how to listen, and an artist who put aside his passion in order to better understand love without an audience. During that time, he grew vegetables, learned to cook Japanese food, spent hours drawing, and played piano with Sean. Those who had known John during the Beatles years were stunned. The man who once mocked everything, who had screamed into microphones with rage, was now patiently peeling fruit for his son and quietly reading books in the library. Some saw it as submission, but for John, it was a process of rediscovering himself after years of rebellion and running from his past. By the late 1970s, as Sean began to grow up, John felt the urge to return to music. He started writing songs again for the first time in years, and recorded Double Fantasy with Yoko Ono. The album was structured as a conversation between the two, alternating tracks from John and Yoko, like a musical diary of their marriage. In Watching the Wheels, he sang about how people didn't understand why he chose to stop spinning with the world. Beautiful Boy was a tender love letter to Sean, gentle, affectionate, and almost a late attempt at redemption. The album was released in November 1980, and just 3 weeks later, John was murdered outside his home by Mark David Chapman, a man who called himself a fan. His death was not only a personal tragedy, but a collective wound. The artist who urged the world to give peace a chance was taken by senseless violence. But John Lennon is not defined by his death. The legacy he left behind is far greater. Above all, he remains one of the most influential creators of the 20th century. With the Beatles, he completely reshaped the concept of popular music, not just in sound, but in social role, political consciousness, and personal identity. He showed the world that a pop song could be a manifesto. Imagine a secular prayer without borders, without war, continues to resonate whenever humanity longs for hope. Lennon's ideals live on in art and activism. He was among the first to turn the concert stage into a platform for political expression, advocating for peace, women's rights, racial equality, and love. Generations of artists, from U2 to Radiohead, have acknowledged his influence in their work and worldview. In popular culture, John Lennon, long hair, round glasses, sleeveless New York City shirt, became an enduring symbol of a generation that refused to conform. Many have likened him to a more vulnerable Bob Dylan or a Picasso of pop music, constantly transforming, constantly defying convention. More than 40 years after his death, John Lennon's name remains a living legacy in museums, documentaries, biographies, and daily covers of his songs. Not just for the music, but for the man, a legend who was never perfect, but always brave enough to confront that imperfection. John Lennon was never a symbol of obedience, nor did he ever seek out ideal role models to follow. He was a breaker of molds, sometimes through music, sometimes through the wounds and turmoil within his own soul. For Lennon, art wasn't about pleasing the public. It was about having a dialogue with himself, even when that dialogue was uncomfortable, controversial, or misunderstood. From a boy abandoned by his mother, raised amid family fractures and the shadow of war, John Lennon rose to become one of the most influential voices of the 20th century. But fame didn't erase the broken pieces inside him. It only made them more visible. He wrote about peace while still wrestling with anger. He sang about love while often hurting those closest to him. And it's precisely that contradiction that made him real. Not a saint, but a man, fierce and fragile all at once. John Lennon didn't die on the night of December 8, 1980. He lives on in every song that chokes us up, in every black and white photo hanging on the walls of people who never met him, in every unanswered question about forgiveness, about peace, about whether we can truly love without hurting each other. Because in the end, Lennon doesn't need to be idolized. He just needs to be heard. And even now, the world still falls silent when the first notes of Imagine begin to play, like a whisper from the past, reminding us of a man who dared to dream a dream for all humanity. So what do you think about John Lennon's deeply emotional journey? What mark has he left on your heart through his timeless melodies and life story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe to join us as we continue exploring the stories behind the legends of music.